Have you ever met someone who barely speaks in a crowded room, yet somehow seems to notice everything? Someone who listens more than they talk. Someone who appears calm on the outside, but carries an entire universe inside their mind. Someone who can sit quietly while others compete for attention, yet when they finally speak, everyone listens. Most people assume quiet people are simply shy. Some think they're antisocial. Others believe they're insecure, withdrawn, or uninterested. But what if their silence has a deeper story? What if the quietest people in the room aren't quiet by accident? What if their silence was shaped years before anyone ever met them? Because behind many quiet adults lies a childhood that taught them lessons most people never see. Lessons that changed the way they communicate, the way they trust, the way they love, the way they move through the world. And once you understand these hidden experiences, you'll never look at quiet people the same way again. The first thing many quiet people learned during childhood was that speaking didn't always feel safe. Not necessarily physically unsafe, emotionally unsafe. Maybe they grew up in a home where every opinion was criticized, where every mistake became a lecture, where expressing feelings led to judgment instead of understanding. Children learn quickly, much faster than adults realize. When a child repeatedly feels dismissed, interrupted, mocked, or misunderstood, they begin adapting. Not because something is wrong with them, because they're trying to protect themselves. Over time, they discover something. Silence feels safer than vulnerability. And what begins as protection slowly becomes a habit. Years later, people see a quiet adult. What they don't see is the child who learned to keep certain thoughts hidden. The second lesson many quiet people learned is that observation can be more useful than participation. When you're a child growing up in an unpredictable environment, you become highly aware of other people's moods. You learn to read expressions, tone changes, body language, energy shifts. You start paying attention to details most people overlook. Why? Because awareness becomes survival. You need to know when someone is angry, when someone is disappointed, when someone is about to start an argument, when someone is having a bad day. The child becomes an observer, and that observer often remains long after childhood ends. This is why many quiet adults seem unusually perceptive. They've spent years studying people, not from books, from experience. The third lesson many quiet people learned is that attention can be dangerous. For some children, attention brought criticism. Attention brought pressure. Attention brought expectations. Attention brought conflict. As a result, they discovered that staying in the background felt safer than standing in the spotlight. They learned to avoid unnecessary attention, not because they lacked ability, because visibility felt uncomfortable. Years later, people wonder why they're hesitant to promote themselves, why they downplay accomplishments, why they avoid being the center of attention. The answer often goes much deeper than simple personality. It goes back to what attention meant when they were young. The fourth lesson many quiet people learned is that they had to solve problems alone. Perhaps they reached out for support and didn't receive it. Perhaps their feelings were minimized. Perhaps they were told to toughen up. Perhaps nobody noticed their struggles. Whatever the reason, many quiet children gradually learn self-reliance. At first, this seems like strength, and in many ways it is. But it also comes with a cost. They become uncomfortable asking for help. They carry burdens silently. They struggle to let others support them, because deep down, a part of them still believes they have to handle everything alone, even when they don't. The fifth lesson many quiet people learned is that their inner world was safer than the outside world. When external environments feel overwhelming, many children retreat inward, into imagination, into books, into thoughts, into creativity, into daydreams, into private worlds where they feel understood. Over time, these inner worlds become incredibly rich. This is one reason quiet people often possess remarkable depth. They've spent years exploring thoughts, ideas, emotions, and possibilities that others rarely consider. Their silence is not emptiness, it's activity. Their mind is rarely quiet, even when they are. The sixth lesson many quiet people learned is that conflict should be avoided whenever possible. Perhaps they witnessed frequent arguments. Perhaps they became caught between family members. Perhaps they experienced emotional volatility. Children exposed to repeated conflict often become peacekeepers. They learn how to avoid tension, how to keep others calm, how to prevent problems before they start. While this can make them compassionate adults, it can also create challenges. They may struggle with confrontation. They may avoid difficult conversations. They may tolerate behavior they shouldn't tolerate simply to keep peace, because peace became associated with safety, and safety became a priority. The seventh lesson many quiet people learned is that being understood is rare. This lesson leaves a deep mark. Many quiet children feel different from those around them. Not necessarily better, not necessarily worse, just different. They think differently, feel differently, process experiences differently. And when those differences aren't understood, they begin keeping parts of themselves hidden. Over time, they become selective, careful, protective. Not everyone gets access to their true thoughts. Not everyone sees the full version of who they are. Trust becomes something earned rather than freely given. The eighth lesson many quiet people learned is that emotions are powerful, sometimes too powerful. Many quiet children experience emotions intensely. They feel things deeply. Criticism affects them deeply. Rejection affects them deeply. Conflict affects them deeply. Loss affects them deeply. Because these emotional experiences feel so intense, they often become cautious about revealing them. People assume they're unemotional because they're quiet. The truth is often the opposite. Many quiet people feel more than they show. Far more. The ninth lesson many quiet people learned is that listening creates connection. While others focused on speaking, they focused on understanding. They became listeners, observers, students of human nature. They learned what people fear, what people want, what people hide, what people reveal without realizing it. And because of this, many quiet people develop extraordinary emotional intelligence, not because they studied psychology, because they spent years watching human behavior unfold in front of them. The 10th lesson many quiet people learned is that strength doesn't always look loud. Society often celebrates loud confidence, bold personalities, strong opinions, big voices. But many quiet children discover another kind of strength, the strength of patience, the strength of observation, the strength of endurance, the strength of self-control, the strength of remaining calm while others panic. This strength is easy to overlook because it doesn't demand attention, yet it often proves incredibly powerful throughout life. But perhaps the most important lesson of all is the one nobody talks about. The lesson that explains why some quiet people become deeply wise while others remain trapped behind emotional walls. The lesson that shapes their relationships, their confidence, and their ability to trust. Because there is one hidden experience that influences almost every other lesson we've discussed. One experience many quiet people carry without fully realizing it. And once you understand this final piece, the entire puzzle begins to make sense. It explains why some quiet people seem mysterious, why they guard their inner world so carefully, why they often struggle to let others get close, why their silence can sometimes contain both strength and sadness at the same time. The truth is that many quiet people aren't hiding because they have nothing to say. They're hiding because of something they learned long ago. Something that changed the way they see themselves, the way they see others, and the way they experience connection. And once that lesson takes root in childhood, it can quietly shape the rest of a person's life in ways they may never fully recognize until they finally understand where it came from. Because the 11th and perhaps most powerful lesson many quiet people learn in childhood is this. They learn that being fully seen can feel risky, not because they have something to hide, not because they're dishonest, but because somewhere along the way, showing their true self led to disappointment. Maybe they shared an idea and were laughed at. Maybe they expressed a feeling and were dismissed. Maybe they revealed a vulnerability and it was used against them. Maybe they simply learned that the people around them weren't emotionally available enough to understand them. Whatever the reason, the message settled deep inside. Be careful. Don't reveal too much. Protect certain parts of yourself. Stay guarded. And over time, that message becomes automatic. The child grows into an adult who appears private, reserved, and difficult to read. But what most people don't understand is that this isn't always a lack of trust. Sometimes it's a habit formed long before the current relationship ever existed. A habit created by experiences that taught them caution. This is why many quiet people can spend years surrounded by others while still feeling unseen. They share enough to function, enough to connect, enough to participate, but rarely enough to feel completely known, because complete visibility still feels unfamiliar, and unfamiliar things often feel dangerous. Yet something fascinating happens when a quiet person finally meets someone they trust, someone patient, someone genuine, someone who listens without judgment, someone who doesn't force openness but creates safety. The transformation can be remarkable. The person others believed had little to say suddenly reveals incredible depth. Stories, ideas, insights, humor, dreams, observations, passions, entire worlds that were hidden beneath years of silence. And people are often shocked. They wonder where all of this came from. But the truth is simple. It was always there. The quiet person wasn't empty. They were careful. There is an important distinction between silence and absence. Many people confuse the two. Silence simply means something has not been expressed. It doesn't mean nothing exists. In fact, some of the deepest thinkers spend much of their lives appearing quiet, not because they lack thoughts, because they have so many. Their minds are constantly processing, analyzing, connecting, reflecting, questioning, learning, growing. The conversation happening inside often feels more interesting than the conversation happening outside, and this creates another challenge. Many quiet people become exceptionally self-aware. They spend so much time reflecting that they understand their own strengths and weaknesses with unusual clarity. This can be valuable, but it can also become exhausting. Because self-awareness without self-compassion can turn into self-criticism. The quiet child who spent years analyzing situations often becomes the adult who analyzes themselves. Every mistake, every interaction, every decision, every failure, and sometimes they become their own harshest judge. Few people realize how much pressure some quiet individuals place on themselves, because that pressure remains invisible. It exists behind calm expressions and measured words. Another hidden consequence of childhood is that many quiet people become extremely independent. Again, this sounds positive, and often it is. They learn resilience, resourcefulness, self-sufficiency. They become capable of handling difficulties on their own. But independence developed from necessity carries a unique burden. The burden of believing you must always be strong, always capable, always self-reliant, always fine. As a result, many quiet people struggle when they genuinely need support. Not because they don't want help, because asking feels uncomfortable, foreign, even vulnerable. Part of them still expects that nobody will understand anyway, so they carry more than they should, for longer than they should, in silence. This is one reason people are often surprised when a quiet person finally breaks down. Everyone assumed they were handling everything effortlessly, but nobody saw the weight they were carrying. Nobody saw the years of emotional labor happening beneath the surface. Nobody saw the battles being fought internally. And that's another truth many quiet people know well. The strongest-looking people are not always the least burdened. Sometimes they're simply the most practiced at carrying heavy things. There is also something else that develops in many quiet individuals, a heightened sensitivity to authenticity. Because they've spent so much time observing people, they become remarkably skilled at detecting insincerity. They notice contradictions, hidden motives, performative behavior, false kindness, manipulation. They notice things that others miss. This doesn't mean they're suspicious of everyone. It means they've learned to pay attention, and often their instincts prove surprisingly accurate. This is why many quiet people prefer a few meaningful relationships over dozens of superficial ones. Depth matters more than quantity. Authenticity matters more than popularity. Connection matters more than attention. To them, a single genuine conversation often feels more valuable than 100 shallow interactions. But perhaps the most misunderstood thing about quiet people is that many of them desperately want connection. This surprises people, because from the outside, they can appear distant, reserved, detached. Yet many quiet individuals crave meaningful connection just as deeply as anyone else, sometimes even more. The difference is that they're not searching for constant interaction. They're searching for understanding. They don't necessarily want more conversations. They want real conversations. They don't necessarily want more relationships. They want genuine relationships. They don't necessarily want attention. They want acceptance. And those are very different things. This is where many quiet people experience one of life's greatest frustrations. They are often judged by their silence rather than understood beyond it. People assume they're arrogant, shy, disinterested, unfriendly, when in reality, none of those assumptions may be true. The person who says little may care deeply. The person who stays quiet may be paying close attention. The person who keeps distance may simply need more time to trust. Unfortunately, first impressions rarely reveal these complexities, and so many quiet people spend years being misunderstood. Yet this misunderstanding often contributes to their growth because it teaches them something important. Not everyone will understand you. Not everyone needs to. This lesson becomes incredibly freeing. Eventually, they stop trying to explain themselves to everyone. They stop chasing universal approval. They stop molding themselves into whatever others expect. Instead, they focus on authenticity, on becoming comfortable with who they truly are. And this is where many quiet people begin to flourish. Because once they stop viewing their quiet nature as a flaw, everything changes. Their listening becomes a strength. Their thoughtfulness becomes a strength. Their patience becomes a strength. Their awareness becomes a strength. Their depth becomes a strength. The very traits they once felt insecure about become valuable assets. And perhaps that's the greatest transformation of all. The quiet child who once felt invisible begins recognizing their own value. The child who felt misunderstood begins understanding themselves. The child who hid their voice begins discovering when and where to use it. Not loudly, not constantly, but intentionally. And intentional voices often carry tremendous power. Think about the people whose words stay with you. They're not always the loudest people you've met. Often they're the people who speak carefully, thoughtfully, purposefully. The people who choose their words rather than simply filling silence. Many quiet individuals eventually become these people, not because silence made them weak, because silence taught them the value of meaningful expression. And with age comes another realization. The things that once made them feel different often become the things that make them valuable. Their empathy, their awareness, their ability to listen, their emotional depth, their resilience, their capacity for reflection. All of it begins to make sense. The childhood experiences that once felt confusing reveal unexpected gifts. Not because the difficult experiences were good, but because growth emerged from them. Wisdom emerged from them. Strength emerged from them. And perhaps that's the hidden truth about quiet people. Their silence is often not emptiness. It's history. It's adaptation. It's observation. It's protection. It's depth. It's a lifetime of lessons that most people never see. Every quiet person has a different story, different experiences, different wounds, different reasons. But many share one thing in common. There is far more happening beneath the surface than the world realizes. So the next time you meet someone quiet, remember this. You may not be looking at someone with nothing to say. You may be looking at someone who learned long ago that words are valuable. someone who understands the power of listening, someone who carries experiences they rarely discuss, someone whose silence contains entire chapters of their life. And sometimes the deepest stories are not told by the loudest voices. Sometimes they live inside the people who learn to speak less, observe more, and carry their world quietly. Not because they are weak, not because they are broken, but because life taught them lessons that made them who they are. And once you understand those lessons, you begin to realize something extraordinary. The quietest person in the room may have one of the most powerful stories you'll ever hear if they're given a reason to tell it.